Talking today about the horror classic, The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Now, just a spoiler warning up front. I'm just going to go through and talk about all my thoughts related to this book and the plot, and I'm going to spoil everything. So if you haven't read this book yet, I recommend you check it out. Actually, it's quite a short book. According to Wikipedia says it's 149 pages. I'm assuming that refers to the original print. My edition is 207 pages, but you can see maybe that's with rather large print, plenty of blank spaces at the end of chapters. So it's a quick and painless read. You can finish it off. I finished this off in a few days. That's me being a slow reader. So recommend that if you haven't read this book yet, you stop the video, go and quickly read it, and then maybe come back in a couple days. But I'm going to press on. So I talked about my history with this book in a started video that I made. I'll link to it in the description down below. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but just to summarize briefly, H.G. Wells was an author I discovered as a child through the series of series of books called Great Classics Illustrated, which if you didn't grow up with these books, they're classic books simplified and illustrated for children. Now, I was just checking this on Wikipedia. According to Wikipedia, there is a Great Classics Illustrated version of The Invisible Man, but it didn't come out until 1995, which was after my time. I was already in high school by that time. Great Classics Illustrated is for elementary school kids, and I was in elementary school in the 80s, and at that time read those books. And at that time, in the 80s, the ones by H.G. Wells that they had in the series were War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. And I really loved those. And so that prompted me to try and check out other books by H.G. Wells, not in the Great Classics series, at least not in that time. Sorry, Great Classics Illustrated series. I was also at the same time interested in the classic monster movies. And of course, The Invisible Man was a classic Universal monster movie made in 1933. And I forget if I saw the movie before or after I read the book. But both of them were in middle school sometime, either 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. I don't think it was 8th grade. Either about 6th or 7th grade, if memory serves. Now, when I read The Invisible Man, the book, back in middle school, I found it hard going. I found H.G. Wells's prose style to be a bit dry and unengaging. I felt the book to be slow moving, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. And I read one more H.G. Wells book around that time, The Day of the Comet, which I'll talk about someday in a different video. But came away from that experience with the impression that H.G. Wells was a science fiction writer who had a lot of interesting ideas, but didn't write in a particularly engaging way. Now, like a lot of Victorian era books, and this book was originally published in 1897, I believe. Yep, 1897. I've had this experience with a lot of Victorian era books where I read it back when I was in middle school, struggled with the prose, and then come back to it as an adult. And as an adult, you think, well, this is perfectly easy to read. You just have to mature as a reader, or at least I did. I know some people can tackle these books at a younger age, but there is. I've discovered I really do like H.G. Wells's prose style. It's a little bit different than the modern prose style. It is kind of Victorian, but he's doing a lot of clever things with being slightly ironic with the sentences, and it flows easily enough once you get into it. So yeah, as far as the prose style, I struggled with it as an adolescent. Find it very easy to read now and engaging. Now, as far as the story goes, actually, let me back up a little bit and talk about maybe this as a scary story, since it's the eve of Halloween here when I'm filming this. It's not really that scary. Now, I'm probably not spoiling anything by saying that. I think it's been well observed that older stuff does not maintain its scariness as the generations go on. And that's something I've talked about on this channel before. It's a phenomenon that, on one hand, is probably easily explained by just the media saturation or the violent saturation that makes each generation harder and harder to scare. On the other hand, is something I find endlessly fascinating as like a hallmark of the modern era, because I think it is that, right? Like the ancient Romans never had this issue, right? The ancient Romans would never have said, oh, that book is from 50 years ago, so it's no longer scary today, right? It's only in the modern world that we've had this, right? Or am I wrong? But yeah, it's not really that scary for today's audience. But the thing that you wonder with a book like this is, how scary was it when it came out, or how scary was it meant to be? And I've wondered that with a lot of these horror classics. I read Frankenstein and reviewed it on this channel about 3 or 4 years ago. And had the same questions with Frankenstein. Now, this is a slight digression, but Frankenstein seemed to me like it was not really trying to be scary. Like it was trying to be a Greek tragedy. Like you were supposed to feel the pathos of these characters dying and of Victor Frankenstein's increasing isolation. But I didn't really feel like it was trying to be scary. There were kind of some gothic elements to it, but I didn't feel like horror was the tone that they were trying for. Let me know if I'm wrong or if you got a different impression. But the impression I got with Frankenstein is that it's become a horror classic because of the Universal movies of the 30s and 40s. And I'd be tempted to say the same thing about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I read a few years ago, and also did not get the impression that was supposed to be scary in any way. And maybe that also, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was also part of the Universal horror franchises in the 30s and 40s. So I wonder if that also got grandfathered in as a horror classic because of that. And I wonder a little bit the same thing about the Invisible Man. It was a part of the Universal horror movies. 1933, they brought it back for their second wave in the late 30s and 40s with The Invisible Man Returns and a whole series of Invisible Man movies. But how scary was this originally supposed to be? I got the impression through most of this book like H.G. Wells wasn't even trying to be scary. And in fact, I got the impression that he was trying to be funny more often than he was trying to be scary. Now, I guess something that's worth keeping in mind is that back in his day, I think H.G. Wells was just as noted for his comic novels, his funny novels, as he was for his science fiction. There's The History of Mr. Polly, which I think is largely forgotten nowadays, although probably not forgotten on BookTube. I think Steve Donahue has talked about it a couple times on his channel. I just recently saw this over at The Guardian on their list of the 100 best books of all time. You can debate that list, but I guess the point being, maybe it's not completely forgotten, but largely forgotten, right? The average man on the street. I haven't yet read that book, but I'm aware of it. It's on my list of to be read books. So point being, I guess, H.G. Wells does definitely have a comic side. He's capable of writing comic novels. Uh, and in the first half of this book, especially, there's a lot of comedy. I mean, the Invisible Man shows up in a hotel in the middle of the countryside, in which there are a bunch of bumbling countryside characters who are trying to figure out what the mystery of this invisible man is, and are described in very comic ways. And I think the book gets increasingly serious near the end, but there are a lot of comic scenes throughout the first half of the novel, and I get the impression that well, I think that's definitely what H.G. Wells was going for. But there are some scenes where the tone can shift very suddenly, and in a way that I found very interesting as I was reading this. So there's one scene where two of the countryside characters. This is after the Invisible Man has been unveiled, so they know the Invisible Man now is a thing, and they're going through his stuff and making comments on it. And one of the characters finds his diary and says, "Oh, okay, well this is in Greek," and he gives it to the vicar. Vicar, I think, being like the priest in the Anglican Church. He said, "Okay, well you should be able to read this then." And the vicar has completely forgotten his Greek. This is something you have to study in seminary, I guess, but he's completely forgotten it. But he doesn't want for everyone to realize that he's forgotten his Greek. So he says, "Well, let's look at the whole book. We want to get an overall sense of it before we get into the details." And he's trying to make excuses not to try and translate the Greek. And while this kind of banter is going on, they all of a sudden get interrupted by a very cold and malicious voice who kind of grabs the back of their necks and starts ordering them around. And that tone shift from being kind of a very humorous, lighthearted scene to all of a sudden this invisible entity has just reached out and grabbed you. And then the Invisible Man is portrayed throughout this book as a very malicious figure and a somewhat crazy figure. So when he suddenly enters into the scene, you're suddenly on edge. And there are a couple other places where I thought that kind of tonal shift was done in a way that kept me on my toes as a reader, kept me engaged, in suspense with the book. So I thought that element of it was very well done. The pacing of this book, I think, is something I remember frustrating me back when I read this as an adolescent. Now that I'm an adult, my reading speed is increased. So I don't really want to complain too much about the pacing in a book that's essentially a novella, a very short book. Nevertheless, I think it does, by modern standards, maybe suffer a little bit. So the book opens with a mysterious stranger entering the inn. And he's got his face all wrapped up in bandages, and he's got dark spectacles hiding his eyes. He's got a hat that he never takes off. Um, and of course, the modern reader knows instantly that this is the Invisible Man, because that's what the Invisible Man looks like. Now, of course, the modern reader is also familiar with the Invisible Man through almost 100 years, 90 or 80 years of popular culture by this point, where that iconic cinematic figure from those 1930s and 40s movies has been in cartoons and has been parodied so much that the wrapped up face in bandages you iconically know as the Invisible Man. So the modern reader, because of pop culture saturation, arguably has an advantage over the original reader of this book in 1897. Nonetheless, the title of the book is The Invisible Man. So even to Wells's original audience, it must have been obvious that there was an invisible man popping up in this book somewhere, right? Except, according to Wikipedia, this book was originally serialized in Pearson's Weekly in 1897 before it got published in book form in the same year. And I can't really find any information about what title it was serialized under. Probably it was serialized under the same name, because I imagine that's how these things work. But I like to imagine that just possibly it was serialized under a different name. You know, something like maybe The Mysterious Stranger or something. Because if it was serialized under a different name, then the first 50 pages, the first 12 chapters, before we get to the unveiling of the stranger, would actually make a lot more sense. Because he shows up all wrapped up in bandages, and again, remember, it's 1897. You don't know anything about this character from pop culture. People are speculating, was he in a horrible accident? Is he hiding from the police, and that's why he's got his face all wrapped up? What happened to him? And that speculation, and then the various hints along the way that are just kind of gradually revealed. I mean, it becomes more and more obvious. So by the time he takes off his bandages and reveals himself to be invisible, I think by that point, even the slower readers will have grasped it. Sorry, that wasn't chapter 12. I'm reading my Roman numerals wrong. That was chapter 7. Chapter 7, in which he unveils himself. I mean, by that point, it's pretty obvious he's invisible. But, if you assume this was serialized under a different title, perhaps the original readers had some more suspense, at least in the beginning chapters. But at any rate, the modern reader obviously knows this is the Invisible Man, and we have to wait essentially 50 pages. For 50 pages in this edition. The page numbers will vary, I'm sure. For the Invisible Man to reveal himself. Now, the good news is, again, in those 50 pages, we do get... Wells' prose is quite good. We do get several comic elements. It is very readable. But then, yeah, from page 50... we're finally into the villagers confronting the Invisible Man. Now, I mentioned that I had seen the movie around the same time I've read this book. I've not seen the movie recently. I think it's been years since I saw the movie. If memory serves, in the movie, I should look this up on Wikipedia. In the movie, I think there's something about how the chemicals have driven the Invisible Man insane, and maybe have given him like extra superpower or something like that. there's no real hints of that in the book. He's just a very malicious, self-obsessed man who does come up quite strong in the book, and in the scenes where he's confronting the villagers, and the villagers get hit by him or knocked down by him. It does seem like he's quite powerful, but I guess there's nothing in here about superhuman strength. It's just kind of a man on the stronger side of average, who's very malicious and just, I guess, just naturally prone to losing his temper and these outbursts of rage, which I get the impression in the book was just part of his natural temperament, the way he was already. I think maybe in the movie it's the chemicals that have driven him insane or something. But anyways, point being, in the book, he's a very malicious, vindictive man. He's trying to run these experiments, but he needs money to pay for his hotel room, which leads him to try and do some invisible burglaries. And he gets very upset with these villagers trying to break in, or trying to peep into his room at the hotel and see what he's doing. And eventually this leads to confrontation. Oh, something I should mention. It's interesting reading this book and reflecting on the fact that the whole story of the Invisible Man revolves around how miserable the weather is in England. So in that respect, I guess it's one of the quintessential British books. If this story had been, if H.G. Wells had grown up in Georgia or something like that, or, out here in Vietnam, you can imagine that the story would have been quite different. But because this is England and because the weather is miserable, the Invisible Man has to keep himself wrapped up in order to stay warm. According to the rules of this story, only his physical body is invisible. It's not like his clothes are invisible or anything like that. So, when he puts on a coat to stay warm, then he can't go outside, because then you just have this invisible coat. This disembodied coat floating around, right? So he's got to wrap up his face and put on the spectacles and put on the hat, which really limits his ability to go out and be invisible. He can be invisible for short periods of time, and the story starts out in the middle of winter. We do get some more temperate weather as time moves on in the story, but I think I've never been to England, but I've been living abroad for 20 years now and have had many British friends. And they uniformly tell me that the weather is just cold and miserable in Britain, more or less year-round. You have some summer days, but you also have a lot of rain. And yeah, you get that impression from this book, like he always has to be thinking about shelter. So that is the big weakness of the Invisible Man. And again, it's interesting to speculate how this story would have gone had Wells grown up in a different part of the world, but he didn't. It's in England, and so that's what the Invisible Man has to contend with. But the Invisible Man. Sorry, some noise outside there. Does leave the village. Something I should mention, actually. The narration is, I guess, what they would call third-person narration. And it's... What would you call this? Third-person omniscient or third-person limited? It switches a lot from different characters. Although, I guess at any one moment, you're only seeing the perspective of one character. But then it will switch some chapters it will switch from many different characters. According to Wikipedia, this is one of the first books that Wells wrote which was not using first-person narratives. Excuse me. Wikipedia says that the predecessors of this book were The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau. Those are books that Wells wrote before this one. Those were using first-person narrators. Here, Wikipedia calls this a third-person objective point of view in The Invisible Man. The one perspective we don't get is the perspective of the Invisible Man himself. Kind of. We do get the Invisible Man's monologue in the second half of the book. I'll come to that later. But we don't really get the narrator inside the Invisible Man's head. So it's jumping back and forth between the different perspectives of the villagers. And then after the confrontation with the villagers, we get Mr. Thomas Marvel in chapter 9, who's a tramp who's traveling outside of the village. And the Invisible Man sort of forces this tramp to be his unwilling accomplice. So we jump directly to his perspective. Then there's another confrontation with the villagers. And then the Invisible Man leaves the village, or I guess is chased out, depending on how you look at it. And we travel to a different part of England where we completely switch out different characters. And then there's a character called Dr. Kemp, who doesn't get introduced until the second half of the book, but it ends up becoming, I guess, the hero or the protagonist of the second half of the book. So I don't know if this is a complaint or not. Maybe it's a minor complaint, but it is a little bit jarring, switching the points of view. And then, and then figure out that this Dr. Kemp guy, who we as a reader have not been introduced to and don't particularly care about at first, is turning out to be the hero in the second half of the book, is a bit, I don't know, a little bit jarring. Maybe call it a minor complaint. So the Invisible Man is traveling with Thomas Marvel, this tramp who he's forced to be his accomplice. The Invisible Man has at this point decided that he needs some sort of normal person accomplice, because being invisible, it's very limited what he can do in terms of conducting just the normal interactions that you would need to conduct, securing a hotel room, buying food, all that sort of things. So gets Mr. Marvel as his kind of forced accomplice. Mr. Marvel then attempts to flee from the Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man tries to track him down. But then the Invisible Man ends up at Dr. Kemp's house because somehow, and unless I missed something, it's not completely clear how, somehow the Invisible Man realizes that Dr. Kemp is in this town, and Dr. Kemp was a classmate of his at college. It doesn't sound like they were particularly close, but they knew each other. So he assumes Dr. Kemp is going to be his ally. So stays the night at Dr. Kemp's house, and then tries to explain to Dr. Kemp what it is, who he is, and how he came to be this way, and what's been going on with him. So then we do get a monologue from the Invisible Man, which is his backstory and also explains kind of how he views the world. And that monologue goes on for, I don't remember, some 50 pages here, or something like that in the second half of the book. Now, this is, I don't know, I feel like I was losing patience with this a little bit as I read it. So I want to say it goes on just a little bit too long. On the other hand, it's doing everything it needs to do here. I mean, after so long of having the mystery of the invisible man, why is he invisible? Why is he acting so crazy? It is necessary here to get some answers. Now, H.G. Wells, he's called the father of science fiction. I know he's competing with that title for a few other people. But one of the people who supposedly established the genre, and I think with H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and the other science fiction writers of that era, they were actually trying to incorporate science into their science fiction, right? So it wasn't just purely fantasy. There was an overlay of real science and what they wanted to do. And H.G. Wells knew his science. He had started off life as a science teacher, I think, according to Wikipedia or something. One of the first books he published was a biology textbook. So he does attempt to explain the science behind how the invisible man became invisible. Now, science was like my worst subject at school. So probably like a lot of book nerds, I was a history, literature person at school. I like science fiction because I like the imaginative element of it, but I get a little bit scared off when it becomes too sciencey. Now, fortunately, it doesn't become too sciencey. The science parts of this are only about 5 pages. And I'm not sure I followed it exactly or understood it completely, but I felt like I got the gist of it. And it was interesting because up until this point, I thought, okay, the Invisible Man, that's pure fantasy. That's not, things aren't invisible in real life. But the Invisible Man is talking Dr. Kemp through the experiments and talking about how visibility is created by light reflecting off things, how certain things can be transparent, like water or glass. And if glass is put inside of water, the glass can become invisible if they have the same refractive index. I didn't completely understand what refractive index was, but I understood like the main idea of it. They were talking about how light is reflected off different surfaces and how something can be, the glass can appear invisible in water. And then Dr. Kemp says, okay, fine, but the human body is not as transparent as glass. And the Invisible Man says, yes, it is. Remember your biology classes. And he talks about paper, and he talks about how paper is made up of transparent fibers, which are, I guess because of the way they're laid out, they reflect the light. But if you apply oil to paper, then it becomes transparent. And I think what he's talking about, again, I'm not 100% sure I understood this. When you've got like some greasy fast food and you smear it on paper and then that you can see through the paper, I guess that must be the scientific phenomenon that they're referring to. And apparently the tissues in the human body are of the same kind of quality. Like I said, I'm not a science guy, and I don't 100% understand this, but I get the impression that Wells is a science guy, and Wells has thought this through, and Wells has thought of a plausible way in which the human body could theoretically become invisible. Now, according to Wikipedia, again, there's been some nitpicking of this. Apparently, the eyes cannot become invisible and still function. Because, the human eye works by absorbing incoming light. not letting it through completely, and so some of the light has got to be absorbed. Wells kind of acknowledges this when he talks about an experiment the Invisible Man did with a cat before he used the chemicals on himself. And with the cat, the eyes were the one thing that he couldn't quite get to go invisible. And then he kind of hand waves over that by somehow the Invisible Man figured out a way to make his own eyes invisible. I guess that's arguably the part of this book which is completely implausible, is that the eyes would become invisible and still function. I know it's dangerous to put too much faith in Wikipedia, but I get the impression that because the only thing Wikipedia nitpicked is the eyes, the rest of it is more or less theoretically plausible. Like I said, I'm not a science guy, but the point is that there's just enough. The nice thing about H.G. Wells or Jules Verne or the other science fiction writers of their ilk is you get just enough of a little taste of science to kind of lend the book some credibility or make you think, yeah, I wonder. So that part of the book was interesting. Where I think this long backstory of the Invisible Man started to lose me a little bit is then we get into the whole backstory of how the Invisible Man, after he became invisible, how he had to hunt for food and shelter, and the various close calls he had being caught as he was trying to get food and shelter and secure clothing from various places, because as it's described in the book, he because of a conflict he was having with his landlord, he burned his room as he was fleeing out from it. So he's essentially going into the world invisible. Now, something I picked up from extra credits video that they did on H.G. Wells. They said that the Invisible Man is meant to be like the anti-Ayn Rand philosophy. Now, Ayn Rand, of course, was not yet writing at the time H.G. Wells wrote this in 1897, but I guess maybe the philosophy might have been out there. The philosophy of this superhuman individual who completely disregards society and builds something glorious for themselves. The Invisible Man wants to be that person, but he discovers that once he's cut himself out from society, then things like securing clothing and securing food and all these things, securing shelter, all these things which we as human beings are completely reliant on society to provide us, he's actually in a completely vulnerable position. This book here, The Intellectuals in the Masses by John Kerry. I reviewed this book on this channel before. He has a couple chapters devoted to H.G. Wells. He only mentions the Invisible Man very briefly, but he does make a similar point about how this was a theme in Wells's writing around this time, about how the attempt by these geniuses to set themselves off from society ended up in failure. So I guess thematically that's what Wells is doing here, and that's why he devotes that much space to it. I thought maybe it went on a couple beats too long, just in terms of narrative momentum and pacing and holding my interest. But again, maybe I just have a short attention span. Again, I really hate to complain about pacing in such a short book like this, but there you are. found myself getting slightly antsy there. And then at the end, there's a confrontation between the Invisible Man and Dr. Kemp. The Invisible Man wants to recruit Kemp as his accomplice or his visible partner. But Kemp, listening to the Invisible Man, realizes he's completely insane, mentally unstable, and dangerous. The Invisible Man wants to kill. Now, the body count in this book, and maybe this is because of the era in which it was written, body count in this book is very small. Memory serves, there's just one person who gets killed. But the Invisible Man has plans to kill a lot more people. He talks about a reign of terror that he wants to implement to establish his control. So he definitely has ambitions to kill more people and needs to be stopped. Now, speaking of the confrontation between the Invisible Man and Dr. Kemp, which happened at the end of this book, I want to jump back to what I said at the beginning of this review, which is, how scary is this book really? And as I hope I've established throughout this review, being scary does not seem to be the main purpose of this book. There's some philosophy in here, there's some science in here, there's some comedic writing in here. But there are a couple of scenes, and they're not very long, couple pages in the middle, couple pages in the end, where I thought that the book was chilling. Now, it occurs to me, I've been thinking about this a little bit. The Invisible Man he's iconic. He's part of the Universal monster franchises from the golden age of horror films, but he's always been one of the lesser scary creatures, right? The Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman and the Mummy are up here as like genuinely frightening. Okay, I mean, they're not genuinely frightening because nothing from that era really is anymore, but you know what I mean. And then the Invisible Man is kind of down here. I mean, he doesn't really have any superpowers. He's invisible, but he's just a man. If you can get your hands on him, you can grapple with him. Just like you could with any other man, and indeed that happens several times throughout the book. The Invisible Man, the moment he has any kind of weapons, it kind of defeats his power. There is actually a point in this book where he gets a hold of a gun, but then you can see the gun, so that you know exactly where he is, right? Yeah, I mean, speaking of, guns pop up a couple times in this book. And it makes you think, well, if we humans already have guns, how scary is the Invisible Man? Certainly a person with a gun would be much more deadly than the Invisible Man. Maybe that's one of the ironies of the book. The Invisible Man thinks he's going to be so powerful, but what is invisibility compared to technology? And yet, I've been working out this little theory in my head, and I've got this theory that scary stories or horror fiction is actually not about what is statistically deadly. I mean, like car accidents or shootings in America are much more statistically likely to kill you than the Invisible Man would be, even in a world where the Invisible Man might exist. But I think for horror fiction or scary stories, what gets you is not how deadly it actually is, but whether it can kind of tap in to some sort of primitive fear center of your brain. Maybe if you're thinking about evolutionary psychology, something that would have been deadly to our animal ancestors, our ape ancestors. And the idea that there's some sort of lurking threat somewhere around you, but that you can't see it, that can like trigger all sorts of fear centers in your brain. You can easily imagine our monkey ancestors in the jungle being prey to all sorts of tigers hiding in the bushes or something like that. The camouflage of the ancient jungle. Sorry, I know I'm going off on my crackpot psychology, but you get the general idea. Maybe there's something terrifying to the human brain about the idea of being in a room, and you know that in that room there's something that wants to kill you, but you can't see it. Is it over here? Is it over there? Is it outside the room or is it inside the room? And there are a couple passages in this book where it expertly plays on that sensation. One is in the middle when the Invisible Man's accomplice, Mr. Marvel, makes a break for it. And he tries to escape the Invisible Man, and he runs into a village, and then he runs into a bar. He runs into the bar, and the people in the bar are trying to calm him down. "You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut. What's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver, and was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hullo," cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors. "He'll kill me! He's got a knife or something! For God's sake!" "Here you are," said the barman. "Come in here," and he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated. "Don't open the door!" he screamed. "Please don't open the door! Where shall I hide?" And it goes on for another couple pages, but you get that idea, the terror of is the Invisible Man outside and going to get me? Is he inside already? Is he somewhere in here? Now, the part about him having the knife, I guess, does kind of... The knife wouldn't be invisible, but that kind of atmosphere, which is repeated at the climax at the end of the book, when Dr. Kemp is having his showdown with the Invisible Man, that just being sense of unease about, okay, where is he? To a lesser extent, there are some scenes like that earlier in the book, although the earlier scenes I think are played more for comedy. But yeah, that scene I was mentioning where the vicar and the other guy are having this kind of humorous conversation, and then all of a sudden they realize the Invisible Man has gotten their necks. That has an element of it. So there's definitely an element of something creepy about some sections of this book, even though I don't... Well, what do you think? Let me know what you think in the comments. The Invisible Man. Would you call it a horror story? Is it at all scary nowadays? Was it scary for its time? How much was it supposed to be scary? I mean, obviously I'm doing this book for Halloween, but does this really count? Let me know what you think. And I'll stop my thoughts here.